I've been working as a night shift security guard for a few years now. It's a quiet job, mostly walking around an empty office building, making sure everything's in place. The pay isn't great, but it's enough. The nights can be long and boring though, so I usually bring a book or listen to podcasts to pass the time. But lately, things have felt different. It's hard to explain, but I've been feeling like someone's watching me. I know how it sounds, but it's not something I can shake off. At first, I thought it was just me being paranoid, you know? Working alone in the dark can do that to you. But the feeling has been growing stronger, and now it's almost constant. Every time I walk past the rows of empty desks or check the parking lot cameras, I feel eyes on me. But whenever I turn around, there's nothing there, just darkness and silence. I keep telling myself it's nothing. I've always been rational, not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that. But even then, something isn't right. Last night, while doing my usual rounds, I noticed something strange. There's a basement in the building, mostly used for storage, but I don't go down there much. It's cold and damp, and nothing's ever out of place, so I usually just peek in and move on. But this time, something caught my eye. Behind a couple of old filing cabinets, there was a door I had never seen before. I don't know how I missed it. It was like it had always been there, hiding in plain sight. My first thought was that it led to a maintenance room or something like that. But why would it be hidden away like this? I felt a weird sense of dread as I stood there, staring at the door. I can't explain it, but it was like every part of me was screaming not to open it. But of course, I did. I pushed the cabinets aside and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and a musty smell hit me. The air was thick and heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The light inside was dim, just enough to see that it was a small basement room. I took a few steps down, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, and at first, it looked like the room was filled with old office supplies, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe more. They were pinned up in rows, some overlapping, some barely hanging on. I moved closer, my heart pounding. The photos were of people, employees, people I knew. But there was something wrong. They were all taken from strange angles, through windows, around corners, like someone had been spying on them. And then I saw myself. There were pictures of me, too many to count, taken during my shifts. Some were from a distance, but others were close up, almost as if the person was standing right behind me. In one, I was sitting at the security desk, reading a book, completely unaware. In another, I was locking the front doors. And the worst part was that these pictures weren't old. Some of them were from just a few nights ago. I felt sick. Who could have done this? How long had this been going on? I started recognizing faces in the photos, people who used to work here but had left or disappeared suddenly. I remembered hearing that they had found other jobs, moved away, but looking at their photos now, I wasn't so sure. My hands were shaking as I reached for the most recent picture. It was of me, standing in front of the hidden door just moments ago. Someone had taken it while I was pushing the cabinets aside. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at that photo. It felt like time had stopped. Then I heard it, a noise from above. It was faint at first, but then I realized it was the sound of something being moved, like furniture scraping against the floor. Someone was up there, right above me, and they knew I was here. Panic hit me like a wave. I dropped the photo and ran to the door, but when I tried to push it open, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The walls were too thick, and I was too deep underground. My heart was racing, and I could hear my blood pounding in my ears. I banged on the door, shouting for help, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear me. But deep down, I knew it was useless. Whoever was up there wasn't here to help. The noise above stopped suddenly, and everything went quiet. The silence was worse than the sound. It pressed in on me from all sides, making it hard to breathe. I leaned against the door, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My whole body tensed as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, anything. I didn't know what was worse, the thought of being found, or the thought of being left down here, forgotten. The doorknob turned slowly, and I felt a rush of cold air. The door creaked open just a crack, but whoever was on the other side didn't come in. They just stood there, and I couldn't see them in the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But then, nothing. No sound, no movement, just the open door and the darkness beyond it. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't. I was stuck, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. And then the door slowly began to close. The footsteps retreated, and I was left alone, in the dark, with only the sound of my own breathing. I work at a small convenience store in a quiet part of town. It's the kind of place that stays open late into the night, catering to the few people who are still awake at those hours. My shift starts around 10 p.m. and goes until the morning. It's usually dead quiet, with only a handful of customers coming in. Most nights I'm alone with my thoughts, the hum of the refrigerators, and the flickering fluorescent lights that give the place a cold, empty feeling. At first, I found it peaceful. I liked the quiet and the routine. I'd bring a book to read, or sometimes just scroll on my phone to pass the time. The store is small, with just a few aisles and a counter near the entrance. Behind the counter, there's a set of security cameras that show different parts of the store. I'd often glance at them out of boredom, just to see if anything was happening. But lately, I've started feeling different. Something about the emptiness began to make me uneasy. It was as if the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, like the store itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One night, after a slow shift, I was watching the security footage from earlier in the evening. I usually do this to check for anything unusual, like shoplifters or broken merchandise. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the store, right at the edge of the camera's view. The person was wearing a mask, something plain and featureless, like you'd see at a cheap Halloween store. They didn't move, didn't do anything, just stood there, staring directly at the camera. I froze. My first thought was that it was a prank, maybe some kids messing around. I got up and checked outside, but there was no one there. The street was empty, just like it had been all night. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't help feeling unsettled. The next night, I found myself glancing at the cameras more often. I didn't want to admit it, but I was on edge, half expecting to see the masked figure again. And sure enough, there they were, standing in the same spot at the same angle, staring into the camera. This time, I didn't bother checking outside. I knew I wouldn't find anything. Over the next few nights, it got worse. The figure started appearing more often, always at different times, but never when I was looking directly at the live feed. It was like they knew when I was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to show up on the screen. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of unease grew stronger. I started seeing the figure inside the store on the footage, standing motionless in the aisles. I would look up from the screen, expecting to see someone there, but the store was always empty. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The figure was only ever on the cameras, never in person. I knew it was impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figure was always just out of sight, waiting for me to drop my guard. I started checking the cameras obsessively, sometimes every few minutes, just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I double-locked the doors, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Then, one night, I saw something on the footage that made my blood run cold. The masked figure was standing right behind the counter, just inches away from where I had been standing earlier. I hadn't seen or heard anything. It was like they had appeared out of thin air. My hands started to shake as I rewound the footage, watching it over and over, trying to understand how it was possible. But no matter how many times I watched, the result was the same. The figure was there, standing silently behind me, completely unnoticed. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that I had to catch this person, prove to myself that they were real and not just some figment of my imagination. I set up additional cameras in the store, covering every possible angle, and decided to stay late after my shift ended. I was determined to catch them in the act, to finally see the figure with my own eyes. That night, as I sat in the back room watching the cameras, the power suddenly went out. The store was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. My heart started pounding as I grabbed a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I made my way back to the counter. The store was silent, but I could feel the presence of someone or something nearby. As I approached the front of the store, the flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw it, the masked figure, standing just outside the glass door, staring in at me. This time, they didn't vanish when I looked up. They were real, and they were here. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I dropped the flashlight and ran, bursting through the back door and into the night. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the store, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I quit the job the next day, too scared to ever go back. But even after leaving, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of the masked figure in reflections, in the shadows of dark alleys, or in the corner of my eye when I'm alone. I don't know if they're real or if my mind is just playing tricks on me, but I can't escape the fear that they're still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I've been a night nurse at a small hospital for almost 10 years. My job is usually calm, almost too calm, but that changed when I started to notice something strange about room 13. The patients who were admitted there always seemed different, more anxious, more withdrawn. And it wasn't just that they were sick, it was like they knew something I didn't. I tried to ignore it at first, but my unease grew each night I worked. It started with a patient named Mr. Harris. He was an older man, admitted with chest pain. Nothing unusual, really, but something about him stood out. He seemed scared, not just of his condition, but of the room itself. He wouldn't look at the door of room 13 when they wheeled him in. I noticed his hands shaking as he clutched his blanket. One night, when I went to check on him, he was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded as if he'd never been there. I thought maybe he had been moved or discharged without me being told. It happens sometimes when things get busy, but when I checked his file, it wasn't there. Not just misplaced, completely gone, like he never existed. I asked the other nurses, but they looked at me like I was confused. "Mr. Harris? I don't remember anyone by that name," one said, with a shrug that made my skin crawl. But I remembered him. I remembered the way he looked at the door, the way he asked me if he'd be moved to another room soon. I could still hear his voice in my head. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it was a young woman, barely out of her 20s, admitted after a car accident. She had a broken leg, and I remember her crying quietly to herself. I tried to comfort her, but she kept asking to be moved. She didn't want to stay in room 13, and I couldn't blame her. I had that same bad feeling too. But just like Mr. Harris, she vanished. No one seemed to remember her either. The doctors and nurses acted like I was making it up, or worse, like I was losing my mind. I started to doubt myself, but the memories were so clear. I began keeping a notebook, writing down their names, the dates they were admitted, what they said to me. I had to, because every time a patient disappeared, it felt like the hospital was trying to erase them, like they were being wiped from reality. As more patients vanished, the staff started to avoid me. They whispered behind my back, their eyes full of pity. They thought I was paranoid, maybe even unfit to work. I could see it in the way they looked at me, with concern that bordered on fear. But I couldn't stop thinking about the patients. I knew something was happening in room 13, something no one wanted to admit. I felt like I was the only one who cared. Then I met Dr. Williams. He was new, just transferred from another hospital, and seemed more approachable than the others. I decided to confide in him, hoping he might believe me. He listened as I told him everything, from the strange disappearances to how the other staff treated me. He nodded, seemed sympathetic, and promised to look into it. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But soon, I started noticing small things about Dr. Williams that didn't add up. He'd forget things I'd told him before, like we'd never had those conversations. Sometimes, he acted like he didn't even know who I was, only to apologize later and blame it on being tired. It made me uneasy, but I didn't have anyone else to trust. I was alone in this. One night, I decided to stay late and watch room 13. I was determined to find out what was going on, even if it meant breaking some rules. As I hid in a corner, I saw Dr. Williams and a few other staff members wheeling a patient, a woman I'd seen admitted earlier that day, into room 13. She was sedated, her eyes half closed, her body limp. They disappeared inside, and after a few minutes, the door opened again. Dr. Williams came out, but the patient was gone. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I knew then that something terrible was happening, but I had no proof. Only my own eyes and my notebook full of names no one else remembered. Frantic, I ran to the nurses' station to confront the others, but when I got there, they barely acknowledged me. It was like I didn't exist. My heart raced as I returned to my notebook, flipping through the pages, but something was wrong. The last entry, the one about the woman they wheeled into room 13, was missing. No, it wasn't just missing. It was as if I had never written it at all. My hands shook as I tried to remember her name, but it slipped away like sand through my fingers. And then I saw it. My own name, scribbled at the bottom of the page, with today's date next to it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up, and the hallway seemed to close in around me. The walls were too tight, the air too thick. I wasn't safe. I tried to leave, to get out of the hospital, but before I could take a step, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around to see Dr. Williams smiling at me, his eyes cold and empty. "Time for your checkup," he said. And that's when I realized I wasn't the nurse anymore. I was the patient. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door to room 13 closing behind me. Last night, I almost didn't pick him up. It was the end of my shift, and I was exhausted. I had been driving around the city all day, and my eyes were burning from the bright lights and the constant focus. My last fare had just gotten out, and I was thinking about heading home. The streets were empty, unusually quiet for this time of night, and I just wanted to sleep. But then I saw him. He was standing on a corner, just under a flickering streetlight, and he raised his hand when he saw my taxi. I hesitated. Something about him didn't feel right, but I shook it off. I told myself I was just tired, seeing things that weren't there. I figured one more ride wouldn't hurt, so I pulled over. He got in without a word, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the night. His face was pale, almost ghostly under the dim light inside the car, and his eyes looked sharp, too sharp. He gave me an address, and his voice was calm, almost too calm, like he had no worries in the world. I didn't say much, just nodded and started driving. For a while, it was just another ride. The city lights blurred by as I drove through the quiet streets. But then he started talking. At first, it was normal stuff, small talk about the weather, the city, nothing special. But soon, he started saying things that made my heart beat faster. He asked about my day, and when I answered, he smiled like he already knew. Then he mentioned my wife's name, casually, like it was nothing. My stomach twisted. I hadn't told him about her, and it wasn't like I had her picture up in the taxi. "Long day, huh?" he said, his voice still calm. But there was something else there now, something that made my skin crawl. Must be tough, driving all night, especially after what happened last week. I gripped the wheel tighter. Last week, I had a fight with an old friend, a really bad one. We hadn't spoken since. How could this guy know about that? My friend wouldn't have told anyone, and I sure as hell didn't. "How do you know about that?" I asked, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. But he just smiled again, that same eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know a lot of things," he said, his tone light, like he was joking, but there was nothing funny about it. "Like how you were there that night 2 years ago, when it all went wrong." My heart nearly stopped. He couldn't be talking about that night. No one knew about that. No one except me, and I forced myself to breathe, but my mind was racing. I hadn't told a soul. I had buried that memory deep, tried to forget it, but here he was dragging it all back up. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking now. "How do you know all this?" His smile faded, and his eyes locked onto mine in the rearview mirror. They were cold, empty, like he was looking right through me. "Does it matter?" he said, his voice lower now, more serious. "What matters is that I know, and you can't hide from it." I felt like I couldn't breathe. My hands were sweaty on the wheel, and my head was spinning. I wanted to stop the car, to throw him out, but I was too scared to even move. How could this stranger know so much about me? How could he know about the worst thing I had ever done, something I had tried so hard to forget? "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady, but I knew it was pointless. He could see right through me. "Oh, you know," he said softly, leaning forward, his face closer to mine now. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, how much longer can you live with it?" I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, the car screeching to a stop on the side of the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car in gear. "Get out," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Just get out." He didn't move at first, just watched me with those cold eyes. Then, slowly, he opened the door. "Take care, driver," he said as he stepped out, his voice still calm, like nothing had happened. "I'll see you around." He closed the door and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. What the hell just happened? Who was that guy? How did he know so much about me? And what did he mean by "see you around"? I wanted to believe it was just some kind of sick joke, maybe a prank or a coincidence, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was no way he could know those things unless he was somehow connected to my past, to that night. I couldn't drive home after that. I just sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that I wasn't going crazy. But the more I thought about it, the more it all seemed too real, too terrifying to be a dream or a trick. When I finally did drive home, I didn't tell my wife anything. How could I? How could I explain what had just happened when I didn't understand it myself? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that my life would never be the same. Even now, as I write this, I can't stop thinking about him, about what he said. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. I don't know who he was, and I don't know how he knew so much about me. But I do know one thing. He's out there, and he's not done with me. I don't know when or where, but I know he'll be back. And next time, I'm not sure I'll be able to handle it. I've been working as a janitor at Lincoln High for over 10 years. It's not a glamorous job, but it's honest work. I've grown used to the routine, the empty hallways, the quiet classrooms, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It's peaceful in its own way, even though the silence can be a bit unnerving sometimes. The school feels different at night, almost like it's waiting for something to happen. Last week, something did. It was a regular Tuesday night, and I was finishing up my shift. I had just cleaned the gym and was heading toward the old storage room at the far end of the school. This room wasn't used much anymore, just a place where we dumped broken desks and old textbooks. Most of the time, I just mopped the floor quickly and left. But that night, something caught my eye. Under a pile of old chairs in the corner, I noticed a dusty suitcase. It was a strange sight. Everyone who worked here knew the storage room was just for junk. I couldn't remember seeing the suitcase before. It was one of those hard-shell cases, dark brown with a few scuffs and scratches. It looked like it had been there for a long time. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured someone had just forgotten about it. Maybe it was one of the teachers who had left it behind years ago, but the longer I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. There was something off about it, like it didn't belong there. I knew I should have left it alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I dragged the suitcase out and set it on one of the desks. It was heavier than I expected. When I tried to open it, I realized it was locked. That made me hesitate for a moment, but then I decided to force it open. I used a screwdriver from my cart to pop the lock. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The suitcase was full of personal items, photographs, clothes, even a small toy car. But what really shook me was the fact that these weren't just anyone's belongings. The photos were of me. The clothes were mine too. And that toy car, it was a Matchbox car I had lost when I was a kid. I remember crying over it for days. I couldn't understand how these things ended up in this suitcase, in this room. My hands started to shake as I pulled out more items. An old t-shirt I'd worn years ago, a book with my name written inside, a pair of shoes I'd thrown out. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been watching me, collecting my things. But who? And why? My mind raced with questions, but all I could think of was getting out of that room. I shoved everything back into the suitcase and closed it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I needed to leave, but at the same time, I couldn't just walk away. I had to know if someone was still in the school. I grabbed my flashlight and walked back through the hallways, trying to stay calm. But every little noise made me jump, every creak, every rustle. The school, usually so empty and lifeless, suddenly felt alive, like it was breathing. I kept turning around, convinced that I was being followed. The shadows seemed to move on their own, growing and shrinking as I passed by. When I reached the main hallway, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing there. My skin prickled with fear. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew someone was in the school with me. Someone who had been watching me for who knows how long. I hurried back to the janitor's closet, trying to keep my panic in check. I just needed to grab my things and get out. As I approached the door, I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Lying on the floor in front of the door was an item from the suitcase, a piece of my old clothing that I hadn't seen in years. There was no way that could have been there before. I'd just seen it in the suitcase. My legs felt like jelly as I realized what this meant. Whoever had put it there was close, maybe even watching me right now. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my coat and keys and bolted for the exit. I didn't care about locking up or turning off the lights. I just needed to get out of there. When I finally made it outside, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by a lingering sense of dread. I looked around the empty parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. But there was no one there. The school stood silent and dark behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting. I don't know who did this or why. I don't know how long they've been watching me or what they want. But I can't go back to that school. Not after what I found. I keep thinking about quitting, but I'm scared that whoever did this will find me, no matter where I go. I feel like I'm being watched all the time now. Even in my own home, I can't shake the feeling that someone is out there, just waiting. Every night, I check the locks on my doors and windows, but it doesn't help. The fear is always there, lurking just out of sight. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe it's all in my head. But deep down, I know the truth. Someone is watching me. I've been a truck driver for almost 15 years, and I've seen a lot of weird things on the road, but nothing like what happened last month. I'm not sure if I should even be telling this, but maybe someone will understand, or maybe it'll help me sleep better at night. I don't know. It was a late-night haul, the kind I usually enjoy. There's something peaceful about the open road when it's just you, the hum of the engine, and miles of darkness. That night, though, the peace turned into something much darker. I was driving down a stretch of highway that I've been on hundreds of times before. It's one of those roads where you can go hours without seeing another car, just empty fields on either side. The night was pitch black, no moon, no stars, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I was exhausted, but I had a job to do, so I kept going. I don't know what time it was when I saw her. A woman, standing on the side of the road, waving her arms like she was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my tired eyes playing games with me. But as I got closer, I could see her more clearly. She looked scared, desperate. Her clothes were torn and her hair was a mess. She needed help. Every instinct told me to keep driving. I've heard stories about people being tricked or ambushed, especially truckers. But something about her made me stop. I slowed down and pulled over, but as soon as I did, she was gone. Just like that. 1 second she was there, and the next, she wasn't. I even got out of the truck, walked around, checked the bushes on the side of the road. Nothing. It didn't make any sense. I got back in the truck, heart pounding, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe she had run off. Maybe she didn't want help after all. But it didn't feel right. The rest of the drive was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you think something is watching you. About an hour later, I saw her again. The same woman, same desperate look, same frantic waving. This time, I didn't stop. I pressed the gas and sped past her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Why was she out here, in the middle of nowhere? And how did she get ahead of me? It didn't make any sense. My hands were shaking, but I kept driving, trying to focus on the road. The third time I saw her, I couldn't ignore it. She was closer to the middle of the road, forcing me to slow down. I had to know what was going on. even if every part of me was screaming to just keep driving. I pulled over again, but this time I kept the engine running. I didn't get out. I watched her from the truck, waiting for her to disappear again, but she didn't. She stood there, staring at me, her eyes wide with terror. I cracked the window and called out to her, asking if she was okay, if she needed help. She didn't respond. She just kept staring, and then she turned and started walking down the road. Something inside me told me not to follow her, but I did anyway. I inched the truck forward, keeping my distance, watching her in the rearview mirror. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The road where she'd been standing was stained with something dark, almost black. My headlights barely caught it, but when I leaned out the window, I could see it more clearly. It was blood. Fresh blood smeared across the pavement, leading off into the bushes. Panic set in. I knew I should have turned around, but I felt like I was in a trance, like I had to know what had happened. I got out of the truck and followed the trail. It led into the bushes, and the further I went, the stronger the smell of iron became. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Then I saw it. A body lying face down in the dirt. It was a man, not the woman. His clothes were torn, and there was blood everywhere. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. This wasn't just a random accident. Something terrible had happened here. I ran back to the truck, ready to get out of there. But as I turned around, she was standing right in front of me. The woman, only now she wasn't just desperate. She looked angry. Her eyes locked onto mine and she opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just stared at me. Then she turned and walked back into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where she was going. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door, and floored it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I turned on the radio, hoping to distract myself, but the news report made my blood run cold. The announcer was talking about a missing woman, last seen by drivers on the same stretch of highway. They said she'd been seen by multiple people, always alone, always desperate, but she never spoke to anyone. The police were warning people not to stop, that it might be a setup, that people had been disappearing after stopping to help. I realized then that she wasn't the one who needed help. She was the bait. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the truck on the road. I don't know how I made it through the night, but I did. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting. I haven't driven that route since. I don't know if I ever will again, but every time I see someone on the side of the road, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I keep driving. I can't help but wonder if she was really a victim, or if she was part of whatever sick game they were playing. And I can't help but think that next time, I might not be so lucky. I used to think my job at the warehouse was the most boring thing in the world. Every day I packed boxes, sealed them, and stacked them on pallets for shipping. It was the same routine, over and over. The boxes were always the same, small, medium, large, each with a different weight, but none of it was interesting. Sometimes I would zone out, just going through the motions. But that changed one day, and now I wish I could go back to how it was before. It started like any other day. I clocked in, put on my gloves, and started packing. The first few hours went by slowly, but everything seemed normal until I came across a box that felt heavier than usual. As I moved it, I noticed a strange smell. It wasn't like the usual musty odor from cardboard. This was different, sharp, sour, like something rotten. I probably should have just ignored it and moved on, but my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a box cutter and carefully opened a small corner. The smell hit me even harder, making me gag. I pulled back the flaps just enough to see what was inside, and I froze. Wrapped in plastic, I saw what looked like a human hand. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, my mind racing. Was this real? Was it a joke? But who would joke like this? The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't a joke. It was a real human hand, pale and lifeless. My hands were shaking as I quickly sealed the box again, pressing down hard on the tape like that could make what I saw go away. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was a mess of thoughts. Should I report it? Tell someone? But who? And what if I was wrong? What if it was some kind of weird prop or something? I decided to just finish my shift, keep my head down, and act like nothing happened. Maybe it was just a one-time thing, but it wasn't. The next day, I noticed more boxes with the same heavy weight, the same awful smell. I didn't dare open them, but I knew what was inside, and I wasn't the only one who noticed. My supervisor, Mark, started hovering around me more, watching me from a distance. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then he started giving me orders to handle those boxes personally. He even pulled me aside one day and told me, very clearly, not to open any more boxes. Just pack them and ship them, nothing else. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Mark had always been a little strict, but this was different. He wasn't just my boss anymore. He was watching me, making sure I followed orders. The other workers seemed oblivious, going about their business, but I could feel the tension building inside me. Every time I moved a box, I imagined what could be inside, and it made me sick to my stomach. I started noticing the security cameras more too. They were always there, but now I felt like they were following my every move. My nerves were shot. I could barely eat, barely sleep, and the smell, oh God, the smell, was stuck in my nose all the time, like it was burned into my memory. Then came the day that pushed me over the edge. Mark came up to me with a look I hadn't seen before, cold, serious, almost threatening. He handed me a pair of gloves that were thicker than usual and told me to follow him. I did, too scared to refuse. He led me to a part of the warehouse I'd never been to before, where the boxes were stacked high and covered in plastic wrap. "Start packing," he said, his voice flat. I didn't move. I couldn't. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do your job, and keep quiet. You understand?" I nodded, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare. He handed me a box, and when I opened it, I nearly dropped it. Inside was what looked like a human leg, wrapped in plastic just like the hand I saw before. But this time, Mark was watching, making sure I didn't react. My hands shook as I wrapped it up and placed it in another box, sealing it with tape that felt like it was sticking to my skin. After that, I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I was packing human body parts, helping to send them off to who knows where, and I was terrified. I started thinking of ways to get out, quit my job, run away, anything to escape. But Mark's words echoed in my head. "Keep quiet," he had said, and I knew what he meant. If I talked, if I tried to leave, something bad would happen to me. I felt like I was in too deep, like I couldn't escape without losing everything. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to pack those boxes one last time, but I was going to do something different. I found a piece of paper and wrote a note, something simple, just a few words. "Help. There are bodies inside." I slipped the note into one of the boxes before sealing it up, hoping someone, somewhere, would find it. I finished my shift, acting like everything was normal, but inside, I was a wreck. When I left the warehouse, I didn't look back. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing. But the fear was still there, gnawing at me, telling me that I wasn't safe yet. As I reached the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. Don't forget the next shipment tomorrow. My heart sank. I knew I couldn't go back, but I also knew that Mark wasn't going to let me go that easily. I got in my car and drove away, not sure where I was going, just knowing that I had to keep moving. The smell of those boxes stayed with me, and I knew that no matter how far I went, I could never really escape what I had done. I worked the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of town. It's quiet and the hours crawl by, but I don't mind. It's peaceful in a way. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and the only company I have most nights is the occasional driver stopping for gas. But there's one regular who's here every night like clockwork. It's strange how I've come to expect him, almost rely on his presence to break the monotony. He always arrives around 2 a.m., never fails. He's a tall guy, in his mid-40s maybe, with a tired look on his face. We don't talk much, just a nod and a hey as he picks up his usual pack of cigarettes and a coffee. There's something comforting about his routine, like he's part of the background of my nights. Until last week, that is. It was a Thursday night, and everything seemed normal at first. But when he walked in, something felt different. He was quieter, didn't meet my eyes like he usually did. He was wearing a different jacket too, something bulkier, even though the weather hadn't changed. It was enough to make me notice, but not enough to alarm me. I figured he was just having a rough night. We all have those, right? But then he started lingering, taking longer than usual to pick up his things. He walked around the aisle slowly, almost like he was lost or stalling for time. When he finally came to the counter, he didn't say anything. Just put the coffee and cigarettes down and stared at me, waiting for me to ring him up. His eyes were different too, darker somehow, and they made me feel uncomfortable. I told myself I was just imagining things, that it was late and my mind was playing tricks on me. The whole interaction left me feeling uneasy though. After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found myself glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until the end of my shift. But the hours dragged, and my mind kept going back to him, wondering why he seemed so different. During my break, I decided to check the security cameras, just to see if there was anything unusual. It was probably stupid, but I needed to put my mind at ease. The footage showed him coming in, same as always. But as I watched, something caught my eye. A shadow, just outside the camera's view, moving in the background. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. The shadow seemed to be following him, staying just out of sight, but always present. I felt a chill run down my spine. Maybe someone was following him. But why? And why didn't he seem to notice? Or did he? Was that why he was acting so strange? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The rest of my shift was a blur of anxiety. Every small sound made me jump, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back. But the hours passed, and no one else came in. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that it was just a trick of the light on the camera, or maybe even a bug on the lens. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was going to come back. The next night, I was on edge from the moment my shift started. The gas station felt darker than usual, and the hum of the lights seemed louder, more irritating. I kept glancing at the clock, dreading the moment when he would walk in. And then, right on time, he arrived. This time, I was ready, or at least I thought I was. I had decided that I would ask him about the shadow, about why he was acting so strange. But when he walked in, all the words I had planned to say vanished. He didn't look like himself at all. His face was paler, and his hands shook slightly as he grabbed his usual items. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my mouth felt dry, and no words came out. He paid for his things without saying a word, and as he turned to leave, I blurted out, "Are you okay?" He stopped, his back to me, and for a long moment, he didn't move. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was just ignoring me. But then he turned around slowly, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. "You should mind your own business," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't the man I'd gotten used to seeing every night. There was something dark, something threatening in his tone. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. And then, just as I was about to move, the shadow appeared again. This time, it wasn't on the cameras. It was there, outside the window, a dark figure standing just out of the light's reach, watching me. My heart raced as I stared at the figure, trying to make out any details, but it was just a silhouette, blending into the night. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone ready to call for help. But when I looked back up, the figure was gone. I was alone again, or at least I thought I was. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear. I couldn't focus on anything, and every small noise made me jump. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been seeing things because of the stress, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next night, I almost called in sick, but something made me go back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it drove me to show up for my shift, despite the dread gnawing at my insides. When he walked in, I knew something was about to happen. There was a tension in the air, thick and suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he approached the counter, his eyes locking onto mine. This time, I couldn't stay silent. "Who's been following you?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. "It's not me they're following," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Before I could react, the door to the station slammed shut behind me, and I heard the lock click. I turned around, but the station was empty. Or at least it looked that way. The shadow was there, just out of sight, waiting. And that's when I realized I was the one trapped. I work the overnight shift at a small radio station in a town that no one really cares about. It's a quiet job, perfect for someone who doesn't mind being alone. Most nights, I sit in the studio, playing music, taking a few calls, and talking to the empty airwaves. The building is old, the kind that creaks and groans, but it's locked up tight. At night, I'm the only person inside. At least, that's what I always thought. It started last Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. Time blends together when you work nights. I was halfway through my shift when I got the first call. There was nothing unusual about it at first, just a normal request for a song. But then the caller said something that made me pause. "You've got a nice poster of the Beatles on the wall," they said, their voice low and rough. I glanced at the wall beside me, where a faded Beatles poster had hung since before I started working there. I hadn't mentioned it on air. I knew that for sure because no one ever asked about it. It was just there, part of the background noise of the studio. "How did you know about the poster?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, long enough to make me uncomfortable, and then the caller laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was more like they were laughing at me. "I've seen it," they said before hanging up. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe someone who had visited the station before. Maybe a former employee who knew what the place looked like. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next night, the calls started again. The same voice, rough and low, almost whispering. They knew things that made my skin crawl. "You left your coffee on the console," they said once. I looked down, and there it was, my half-empty cup still steaming. Another time, they mentioned how my voice echoed in the hall outside the studio. That was when I started to feel really uneasy, because I hadn't left the studio all night. How could they know what it sounded like out there? Every time I looked out into the hall, it was empty. The doors were locked. I checked them twice, sometimes 3 times, but I couldn't find anyone. I even thought about calling the police, but what would I say? "Hello, officer. I'm getting creepy phone calls and I think someone might be inside the building, but I can't find them?" I could almost hear them laughing at me. But the calls kept coming. Every hour, sometimes more. The voice started getting more personal, talking about things I didn't even realize I was doing. "You're rubbing your eyes," they'd say, right as I did it. "You look tired. You should take a break." I was starting to feel trapped. I didn't want to stay in the studio, but I was too scared to leave. What if I walked out into the hall and found whoever was calling me? What if they were right there, waiting? The thought made my stomach twist. Last night, things got worse. Much worse. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to leave, go home, and maybe even quit the job. It wasn't worth the stress. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. It was like the lock had jammed, even though it had never done that before. I pulled and yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. Then the phone rang again. I didn't want to answer it, but I couldn't help myself. The voice on the other end was calm, almost pleased. "You're not going anywhere," it said. "Why don't you just sit back down? We're not done yet." Panic set in. I ran to the back door, the emergency exit. Same thing, locked tight, no way out. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I could hardly breathe. How did they know? How were they watching me? That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The voice on the phone, it sounded like me. Not exactly, but close enough that I could hear the similarity. Like it was my own voice, twisted and distorted. And then I remembered something that made everything fall into place in the worst possible way. A few months ago, I'd locked myself out of the station. I'd been in a rush, left my keys inside, and had to break in through a window to get back in. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But now, I wondered if maybe someone had followed me in that night. Someone who had been inside the station ever since, hiding, listening, waiting. I was shaking as I made my way back to the studio. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat down in front of the microphone and tried to think. If someone was in the station, they would hear me, no matter where I was. So I decided to do the only thing I could. I broadcasted a message for help, but as soon as I started speaking, I heard it. That voice, my voice, echoing back at me, not from the phone, but from the speakers inside the studio. The words were mine, but the tone was all wrong. It was like someone was speaking over me, using my own voice to drown me out. I stared at the microphone, my hands trembling. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the station, and I hadn't been for a long time. The phone slipped from my hand, and I just sat there, listening to my own distorted voice filling the room, until everything went quiet. I worked the night shift at a small 24-hour diner. It's the kind of place where the neon sign flickers and you can hear the hum of the refrigerator over the silence of the empty streets outside. I've been working here for a while, and you get used to the quiet. Sometimes it feels like the world outside doesn't even exist during those hours. Just me, the diner, and the occasional customer who wanders in, usually truck drivers or people who can't sleep. But something was different that night. It was just past 3 a.m., and I was waiting for my coworker Joe to come in and relieve me. Joe is never late, not once in the year we've worked together. So when 3:30 rolled around and he still wasn't there, I started to feel uneasy. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. That wasn't like Joe. He always picked up, even if it was just to say he was running a few minutes late. By 4 a.m., I was more than just uneasy. The feeling in my gut was like a knot, twisting tighter with every passing minute. I paced around the diner, checking the clock, glancing out the window at the empty street. My thoughts raced. Maybe he had car trouble? Maybe he overslept? But then why wasn't he answering his phone? I decided to clean up the counter, trying to keep myself busy. That's when I saw it. Just by the back exit, something shiny caught my eye. I walked over and found Joe's phone on the floor. The screen was shattered, and when I picked it up, it was dead. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Joe's phone, here in the diner, smashed. My mind went blank for a moment, and then the thoughts came flooding in. What happened? Why was his phone here, and where was he? I stood there, holding the phone, trying to make sense of it. But nothing made sense. The diner was empty. It was just me, alone with this broken phone and a growing sense of dread. I should have called the police right then, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. Instead, I started looking around the diner. I checked the kitchen first. There, on the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A few small drops of blood leading toward the back door. They were barely noticeable, but in the harsh light of the kitchen, they stood out like a warning. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a late night. Something bad had happened. I followed the trail of blood to the back door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I heard a noise from the front of the diner. A creak, like the sound of the door opening. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The front door was slowly swinging open, but no one was there. The street outside was still empty. No cars, no people, just the quiet, heavy darkness of the early morning. I stepped out from the kitchen, my eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the door, open, like an invitation. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I took a few steps forward, trying to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself it was just the wind, just a freak occurrence. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That's when I saw it. A small dark smear on the back door handle. I moved closer, my heart pounding harder with each step. It was blood, fresh blood, smeared across the handle like someone had grabbed it with a bloody hand. My stomach twisted into knots. Joe. Something had happened to Joe, and whatever it wasn't good. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I needed to get out, to call the police, to do something. But before I could move, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The diner was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the neon sign outside. Panic set in. I fumbled for my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to get a grip. My thoughts were a mess, fear clouding every rational thought I tried to have. The darkness pressed in on me, and I felt like I was suffocating. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like someone breathing. It was close, too close. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I turned, trying to see something, anything, in the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the sound of breathing and the pounding of my own heart. I stumbled backward, bumping into a chair, nearly tripping over my own feet. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out. I turned toward the front door, but in the darkness it felt miles away. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound echoed like a threat. I forced myself to take a step, then another, inching closer to the exit. As I reached the door, my hand finally found the cold metal of the handle. I pulled it open, the night air rushing in like a breath of fresh air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran out into the empty street, the diner behind me, and kept running until my legs gave out and I collapsed, gasping for breath. I don't know what happened to Joe that night, or what was in that diner with me. I never went back to find out. All I know is that something was there, something dark and dangerous, and it wasn't just in my head. If you ever work the night shift, alone in a quiet place, and something doesn't feel right, trust that feeling. Get out. Because whatever happened to Joe, it could happen to you too. I've worked as a night shift receptionist at this hotel for about a year now. Most nights are quiet, almost boring, with nothing but the hum of the vending machine and the soft ticking of the clock to keep me company. I usually spend my time scrolling through my phone, answering the occasional call from guests, and sometimes catching up on the latest TV shows on the lobby TV. The night I'm about to tell you about started like any other, but it turned into something I still can't fully explain. It was around midnight when I first noticed something was off. There was this strange feeling in the air, like the kind of tension you feel before a storm. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many late nights. But then, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. Room 6666, it said. That was strange because I knew our hotel inside and out, and we didn't have a room 666. I hesitated, but then I answered, "Hello, front desk. How may I help you?" There was nothing on the other end, just static. I repeated my greeting, but still, no response. After a few seconds, I hung up, feeling a little uneasy. I chalked it up to a glitch. Maybe someone's phone got crossed with our lines or something. I tried to shake it off, but that strange feeling from earlier only got stronger. Over the next hour, the calls kept coming. Every time the phone rang, it was the same. Room 6666 on the caller ID. And every time there was only static or sometimes faint breathing. The sound of it made my skin crawl. I checked the hotel's floor plan, just to be sure, and as I expected, there was no room 666. The highest floor in our building was the 5th, and we didn't skip numbers. I even double-checked with our records, but nothing turned up. I started to feel real fear creeping in, but I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. But the calls didn't stop. At some point, I tried to ignore it, thinking it would just go away. I buried myself in work, pretending that the phone wasn't ringing. But with every ring, the anxiety in my chest tightened like a vice. The silence that followed each call was worse than the calls themselves, heavy and suffocating. It felt like the whole hotel was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do something about it. First, I checked the security cameras. I scanned the footage from every floor, but nothing was out of place. The hallways were empty, and no one was even near the phones in the guest rooms. Still, the calls kept coming. Finally, I tried to trace them, thinking I'd at least figure out where they were coming from. What I found made my blood run cold. The calls were coming from inside the hotel, but from a part of the building that didn't exist. According to the trace, the calls were coming from a location deep within the hotel, almost as if they were buried within the walls themselves. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. I knew every inch of this building, and there was no place like that. I felt panic rising in my throat, but I tried to keep it together. There had to be an explanation. Maybe there was some kind of hidden maintenance room or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Desperate for answers, I dug through the hotel's old records, something I'd never done before. It took me a while, but I finally found something disturbing. Years ago, long before the current management took over, there was an accident during the construction of an extra floor. It was supposed to be an additional level above the fifth floor, but something went terribly wrong. Several workers died in a freak accident, and the project was abandoned. The floor was never finished, and the plans were changed to erase all evidence that it was ever supposed to exist. It was as if the hotel management wanted to pretend that whole level never happened. But the calls, they made me think that maybe it didn't disappear completely. Maybe something was left behind, something that was never meant to be found. By this point, I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended. I wanted to get out of there, to leave, and never come back. But just as I was about to clock out, the phone rang again. My heart pounded as I looked at the caller ID. Room 6666. I didn't want to answer, but I knew I had to. With a trembling hand, I picked up the receiver. This time, there was no static, no breathing. Instead, a voice spoke. It was clear, cold, and it said my name. "Come to room 666, it whispered. The line went dead. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My mind was racing. Was it a prank? It had to be. But who would go to such lengths? And why did it feel so real, so undeniably real? I ran out of the hotel that night without looking back. I quit the next day, and I've never set foot in that place again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear the phone ringing in my head. I don't know what was really going on in that hotel. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there's something there that no one's supposed to find. But whatever it was, I'll never forget that voice, cold and clear, calling me to a room that should never have existed. I work as a night guard at an old famous museum in the city. It's a quiet job, mostly uneventful. The kind of job where you can hear your own breathing in the stillness of the night. I liked that at first. The silence was comforting, a break from the noise of the world. But there was one exhibit in particular that always made me feel uneasy. It's in the East Wing, a collection of ancient artifacts, statues, old weapons, tools from long ago. There's nothing unusual about it during the day, but at night, it's different. The shadows from the display lights seem to stretch and move in ways that don't feel right. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it's just my imagination, but that didn't help much. One night, a few weeks into the job, something strange happened. I was doing my usual rounds, walking through the East Wing, when I heard footsteps behind me. Just faint at first, like someone walking softly, trying not to be heard. I stopped and turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The sound stopped as soon as I did. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I thought it must be an echo. The old building had a way of playing tricks on your ears, the sound bouncing off the walls and making it seem like someone was following you. I shrugged it off and continued my rounds, but the footsteps came back. Every time I walked through that exhibit, I would hear them, always the same, just behind me, keeping pace, but never close enough to see who it was. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me, or the old floorboards creaking. But as the nights went on, it became harder to ignore. The footsteps weren't just behind me anymore. They were closer, louder, and sometimes they seemed to come from right beside me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. It started to get to me. I found myself dreading that part of my shift, walking slower through the other exhibits, trying to delay the moment when I'd have to enter the East Wing. My sleep began to suffer. I would lie awake at night, thinking about those footsteps, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started changing my routine. I'd vary the time I passed through the East Wing, thinking maybe it would throw off whoever or whatever was making those footsteps. But it didn't work. No matter when I walked through, the footsteps were always there, always behind me, never in front, never beside, but just far enough back that I couldn't see who it was. One night, after days of mounting anxiety, I decided to confront whatever it was. I walked into the East Wing, trying to act normal, but my heart was pounding. The footsteps started just like always, soft and steady, matching my pace. I clenched my fists, took a deep breath, and stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps kept going for a split second longer before stopping too. My blood went cold. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but of course, the room was empty. The shadows from the artifacts seemed to loom over me, mocking my fear. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time, I was truly scared. I wasn't just hearing things. Something was wrong. I searched the exhibit, looking behind every display, under the benches, even checking the security cameras, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone else in the museum. The cameras didn't show anyone following me either, just me, alone, walking through the silent halls. But those footsteps, I couldn't get them out of my head. The next day, I reported what happened to my supervisor. He laughed it off, saying it was just nerves. That night shifts can do that to you, especially in a place like this. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he hesitated before brushing it off. I wasn't the first one to bring something like this up. He admitted reluctantly that the previous guard had quit suddenly, without explanation. The guy had been here for years. Then one day, he just walked out and never came back. I started digging, asking around, looking into the museum's history. It didn't take long to find out about the rumors. Some said the artifacts in the East Wing were cursed. Others claimed there had been an accident during construction years ago, and the ghost of a worker still roamed the halls. But I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least, I didn't want to. I was sure there had to be a rational explanation, but the more I found out, the more uneasy I became. Then, last night, it happened again. I was making my rounds, trying to keep my mind off those footsteps, telling myself it was all in my head. But as soon as I entered the East Wing, there they were, soft at first, then louder, closer. This time, though, something was different. The footsteps weren't just behind me. They were all around me, echoing off the walls, coming from every direction. I stopped, frozen in place, trying to figure out where they were coming from. But they just kept getting closer and closer until it felt like they were right on top of me. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't listen to me. The footsteps were so close now, I could almost feel the breath of whoever it was on the back of my neck. But when I turned around, there was still nothing. Just the empty room, the shadows, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know what's happening, but I'm scared. I'm more scared than I've ever been in my life. I can't explain it. I can't rationalize it, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I'm posting this here because I don't know who else to tell. Maybe someone will believe me. Maybe someone else has experienced something like this. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind. I don't know. All I know is that I'm not alone in that museum at night, and I don't think I ever was. It was just another late shift on the train, a job I had done countless times before. The night was quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel alone even though you were surrounded by people. The train was nearly empty, as it usually was this time of night, with only a few tired souls scattered throughout the cars. I had settled into my usual routine, checking tickets, walking up and down the aisle, and making sure everything was in order. But something was off tonight. It was nothing I could put my finger on right away, just a feeling that gnawed at me, a sense that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until we were halfway through the line that I noticed him. He was sitting in the far corner of the car, away from the others. He hadn't moved for hours. At first, I didn't think much of it. Passengers fall asleep all the time, especially on these late-night runs. But as the train rolled into another station and more people got off, he stayed put, still as a statue. His head was slightly tilted, his eyes staring straight ahead, unblinking. I told myself he was probably just lost in thought or maybe had one too many drinks. But as I passed by him again, something about his stillness made my skin crawl. The next stop came, and more passengers disembarked. The car was nearly empty now, except for him and a couple of others. I kept stealing glances in his direction, hoping he'd shift or blink or do anything to show he was just a regular guy taking a late train home. But he didn't. I began to feel a knot forming in my stomach. It was strange to feel so uneasy over something so small, but there was something deeply unsettling about his stillness. I thought about checking on him, but I hesitated. What if he was just sleeping? What if I woke him up and he got angry? Or worse, what if something was seriously wrong and I had to deal with it? I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on my work, but the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing mile. I decided that at the next stop, I would approach him. I needed to know if he was okay, or at least convince myself that everything was fine. The train pulled into the final station, the last stop for the night. The other passengers gathered their things and left, leaving the car almost completely empty, except for him. He hadn't moved an inch. The silence in the car was deafening. I took a deep breath and walked over to him, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Sir?" I called out softly, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I was close enough now to see his face clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His skin was pale, far too pale, and there was a strange grayish tint to it. His eyes were open, but they were dull, lifeless. My heart started to race, and I reached out, my hand trembling, to touch his shoulder. It was like touching ice. His skin was cold, stiff. I pulled my hand back quickly, a jolt of fear shooting through me. He wasn't just asleep. He wasn't lost in thought. He was dead. Panic surged through me, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. How long had he been sitting there like that? How many stations had we passed? How many stops had we made, with this dead man just sitting there, unnoticed? The thought was horrifying. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind racing with the implications. Had he boarded the train already dead? Had he died somewhere along the route? I didn't know, and the not knowing was almost worse. I forced myself to take a step back, then another, trying to keep calm. I had to do something, had to call someone. My hands fumbled as I reached for my radio, my voice shaking as I reported what I had found. The minutes that followed felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive. The dead man's lifeless eyes seeming to watch me, accusing me for not noticing sooner, for letting him ride in silence for so long. When the authorities finally arrived, they took over quickly, their faces grim as they confirmed what I already knew. He had been dead for hours, maybe even before he got on the train. They asked me questions, but I could barely focus on the words. All I could think about was how I had walked past him again and again, oblivious to the truth. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I gave my statement, answered their questions, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. When they finally let me go, I was exhausted, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. The image of that man, sitting so still, his dead eyes staring ahead, was burned into my mind. I never worked the late shift again after that night. I couldn't. Every time I thought about going back, I felt that same cold knot of fear in my stomach, that same sense of dread. I started to avoid trains altogether, taking buses or driving whenever I could. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me, that at any moment I might turn a corner and see those lifeless eyes again. I've told this story a few times, but people don't usually believe me. They think I'm exaggerating or that I'm just trying to scare them. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the horror of that night, of realizing that death can be so close, so quiet, that it can sit right next to you and you won't even notice. I've worked at the grocery store for years. My days blend together, each one looking exactly like the last. I stock shelves, check out customers, and pretend to be interested when someone tells me about their day. I've grown used to the routine, the quiet hum of the store, the dullness of it all. I go to work, do my job, and go home. There's comfort in the repetition, even if it sometimes feels like I'm just going through the motions. It was during one of these routine days, while stocking the canned goods aisle, that I found it. I had been placing cans of soup on the shelves, my mind wandering, when I noticed something strange. One of the cans was slightly heavier than the others. I picked it up and felt something shift inside. I turned the can over, and there it was, a small piece of paper tucked into the label. I carefully pulled the note out, trying not to tear it. My heart started to race as I unfolded the paper. It was a small scrap, crumpled, with handwriting that was messy and rushed. It simply said, "Help me." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the note. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would put this here? Why? I glanced around the aisle, but no one was near. Everything seemed normal, just like always. But now, with that note in my hand, the normal felt wrong, like there was something lurking beneath the surface. I wasn't sure what to do. I could have thrown the note away, pretended I never saw it, but something about it felt serious. What if someone really needed help? I slipped the note into my pocket, deciding I'd think about it later. But as I went back to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. During my break, I decided to show the note to my manager. He's a gruff guy, doesn't like nonsense, but I figured he'd know what to do. I walked up to him and explained what I found, holding out the note for him to see. He took it, glanced at it for a second, then handed it back with a chuckle. "Probably just some kid messing around," he said. "Nothing to worry about." I tried to argue, saying that it didn't feel like a joke, but he wasn't having it. He told me to get back to work and stop wasting time. I felt frustrated, but what could I do? If the manager didn't care, who else would? Still, the note stayed in my pocket and in my mind. I couldn't let it go. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to the products I was stocking. I found myself searching the shelves, checking other cans and boxes, hoping, or maybe fearing, that I'd find another note. My coworkers noticed, of course. They started teasing me, calling me detective, asking if I'd cracked the big case yet. I tried to laugh along, but it wasn't funny to me. I knew something was off, even if no one else did. Then, I found the second note. This time, it was inside a cereal box. The note was similar, but now it had a bit more. Along with "Help Me," there was an address. It was a place I didn't recognize, on the other side of town, in an area I knew was run down. My heart pounded as I read it, the urgency in the note clear as day. I went straight to the manager again, practically shoving the note in his face. "You have to do something," I insisted. "This can't be a coincidence." He looked at me with a mix of annoyance and pity, like I was a child making up stories. He didn't even read the note this time, just told me to drop it or I'd be out of a job. I couldn't believe it. How could he be so blind? But I knew arguing wouldn't help. It was up to me now. I had to find out what was going on. After my shift ended, I decided to check out the address. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe nothing, but I had to know. The place was a shabby apartment building, the kind of place you avoid if you can. As I walked up to the entrance, I felt a gnawing fear in my gut. I was in over my head, but I couldn't turn back now. The door was unlocked, so I let myself in. The apartment was dark and smelled of mold. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture knocked over, a broken window, and on the floor, a few more scraps of paper like the ones I found in the store. My hands shook as I picked them up. They didn't make sense, just random words, but I knew they were connected to the notes I found. Then I heard footsteps. My heart nearly stopped. Someone was coming. I quickly shoved the papers into my pocket and looked for a place to hide. Before I could move, the door creaked open, and I froze. A man walked in. His face shadowed, but I could see enough to know he wasn't happy. He looked around the room, and I could tell he knew someone had been there. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. But I wasn't so lucky. His eyes locked on mine, and I knew I was in serious trouble. He didn't say anything, just stepped closer, a menacing look in his eyes. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt like they were closing in. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. The story ends here, with the man advancing on me, and me realizing too late that I shouldn't have gotten involved. The last thing I remember is the sound of my own breathing, loud and desperate, as darkness closed in around me. I don't know what happened next, and maybe that's for the best. All I know is that some doors are better left unopened. I just started my internship at one of the biggest hospitals in the city. It's an old building, with parts of it dating back more than a century. Some sections have been renovated, but there's a wing they call the old wing that everyone says to avoid, especially at night. I didn't think much of it at first. You know how people like to scare the newbies with ghost stories. On my first night shift, a senior nurse named Ellen, who has worked here forever, told me in a very serious tone, "If you value your sanity, don't go near the old wing after dark." She didn't give me a reason, just left it at that. It seemed weird, but I laughed it off. I thought it was just another one of those hospital legends, like the ones I heard about back home. But the more she said it, the more curious I became. Why did she seem so worried? And why was everyone else so tight-lipped about it? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. A few nights later, it was really quiet. No new patients coming in, no emergencies. The kind of quiet that makes the air feel thick, like something is waiting to happen. I found myself thinking about Ellen's warning again. I don't know why, but I decided to check it out. I convinced myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity, nothing more. The old wing was on the far side of the hospital, away from the main wards. The first thing I noticed as I walked over was how the lights seemed dimmer, almost like the darkness was trying to swallow them. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. When I reached the entrance to the old wing, I hesitated for a moment. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a cold draft hit me. The air inside was musty, like the place hadn't been touched in years. The hallways were empty, the silence so loud that my own breathing seemed like a roar. As I walked further in, the lights began to flicker. I tried to convince myself that it was just old wiring, nothing to worry about. But the further I went, the colder it got, and the more uneasy I felt. It was as if the walls were closing in, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then I saw something on the floor. A folder, yellowed with age, just lying there in the middle of the hallway. I picked it up, and the name on the cover was almost unreadable, but the date was from decades ago. Inside were notes about a patient who had been treated for severe mental illness. The details were disturbing, talking about how the patient had claimed to hear voices and see things that weren't there. The last entry said the patient had disappeared from their room one night, never to be seen again. As I read, I heard a noise. At first, it was faint, like the sound of feet shuffling or maybe whispers. But when I looked around, there was no one. The noise grew louder, closer. It felt like it was coming from all around me, but the hallway was empty. Panic started to creep in. My heart raced as I realized that whatever was making that noise wasn't visible, but it was there, and it was getting closer. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a loud bang, like a door slamming shut behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was still empty. My mind was screaming at me to get out, but when I tried to leave, I found that the door I had entered through was now locked. I yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered again, and then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, and that's when I felt it. A presence, something or someone, standing right behind me. I could feel the air move as it breathed down my neck. My skin crawled, and I could feel my heart beating so hard it hurt. I didn't dare move, didn't even dare to breathe. It felt like I was there for hours, paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back on. The door that had been locked now swung open on its own. I didn't waste a second. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back at the nurse's station. Ellen was there, sitting at the desk, her face expressionless. When she looked at me, I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what I had experienced. But she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. That look said everything. I never went back to the old wing after that night. I couldn't. Even during the day, just walking past that area made me feel sick to my stomach. But the worst part is, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in there, whatever was behind me in the dark, didn't stay behind. I keep hearing things, seeing things out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, there's nothing there. I don't know what's real anymore. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it's something worse. All I know is, I should have listened to Ellen's warning. Some things are better left alone. I've been a paramedic for years, seen all kinds of things, but nothing prepared me for the call that came in that night. It was late, close to midnight, when the dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio, directing me to an address far outside town. It was unusual, a house in the middle of nowhere. The details were vague. A woman, possibly elderly, in need of immediate help. The drive took me through a dense forest. The road was barely visible, covered in shadows from the towering trees. My headlights cut through the darkness, but even they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. As I drove deeper into the woods, the radio signal grew weak, cutting in and out, adding to the isolation. Finally, the house came into view. It was an old, crumbling place, almost hidden by the surrounding trees. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the windows were dark, like empty eyes staring out into the night. The front door was slightly open, creaking as the wind pushed against it. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence around me pressing in. Something didn't feel right, but I had a job to do. I grabbed my gear and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots the only sound. I approached the house cautiously, pushing the door open with a gloved hand. Inside, it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of something rotting. "Hello," I called out, but my voice barely echoed back. No response, just silence. I flipped on my flashlight and swept the beam around the room. It was bare, just dusty old furniture and cobwebs. Then I saw her, lying on the floor in the middle of the room, a frail-looking woman, her body still. She was dressed in a dirty nightgown, her hair gray and tangled. She looked unconscious, but something about the scene made me hesitate. I knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was strong, too strong for someone who appeared so weak. Her breathing was steady, too steady. It was as if she was just pretending. But why? My heart started to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise, like a creak coming from upstairs. I froze, listening hard, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came. I turned back to the woman, who hadn't moved at all. My instinct screamed at me that something was wrong, but I couldn't just leave her there. I had to find out what was going on. With my heart pounding, I decided to take a quick look around the house. Maybe there was someone else here, someone who could explain what was going on. I stood up, hesitating for a moment before heading toward the stairs. The old wood groaned under my weight as I made my way up, each step making my unease grow. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with closed doors. I picked the first one on the right and slowly pushed it open. The room inside was empty, just like the one downstairs, except for one thing: a small table with photos scattered across it. I stepped closer, shining my light on them. The photos were old, yellowed with age, but the faces in them were clear. The woman downstairs was in every one of them, but much younger. She was surrounded by men, different in each picture, all smiling but with something in their eyes: fear. My hand shook as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't happy memories. They were trophies. I backed away, the realization hitting me hard. The woman wasn't a victim. She was something else, something far worse. My breath caught in my throat as I heard movement behind me, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I turned around slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The woman stood at the top of the stairs, no longer frail and helpless. Her eyes were wide open, and she was smiling, a twisted, unnatural smile that sent a chill down my spine. She had been faking it all along. Before I could react, she started moving toward me, her steps deliberate, almost too slow. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew I was trapped. Panic surged through me, and I bolted past her, running down the stairs as fast as I could. I could hear her behind me, her steps quickening, but I didn't look back. I reached the front door and slammed it shut behind me, my heart racing. I ran to my ambulance, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Finally, I got in, slamming the door and locking it. I threw the ambulance into gear and sped away, the house disappearing into the darkness behind me. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that cursed place. My hands were still shaking as I pulled over, trying to catch my breath. I glanced at the passenger seat where my bag sat. Something was missing, my ID badge. My mind raced as I realized I must have dropped it inside the house. Then, my radio crackled to life again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the static, barely audible. New call coming in. Same location as before. Need immediate assistance. My blood ran cold. There was no way I was going back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done with me yet. That smile, those eyes, they would haunt me forever. And now she knew where to find me. I still don't know if she ever did. The night shift. Working the night shift at the factory was supposed to be simple. I liked the quiet, the way the machines hummed in the background. It was just me, the rows of steel monsters, and the ticking of the clock until sunrise. The place was mostly empty. just a few machines running to fill small orders. It should have been peaceful. But something about being alone in that huge, dimly lit building always made me feel uneasy, like I wasn't really alone. At first, I tried to ignore it, the sense that someone or something was watching me. I'd shake it off as just the isolation messing with my head, but the feeling stayed. It clung to me like the oily scent of the factory floor. One night, I was making my rounds, checking the machines, when I noticed one of them suddenly turning on by itself. This wasn't just any machine, it was one of the old ones, a model that usually needed a bit of coaxing to start up. But there it was, roaring to life and spitting out product after product. Only, these weren't on the order list. In fact, I hadn't seen anything like them before. I hurried to the computer system to check, but there was nothing. No new orders, no logs showing the machine should be running. It was like the thing had decided to work on its own. I thought maybe it was a glitch, or maybe someone had left a program running by accident. I shut it down, feeling a bit unsettled but not overly worried. Machines malfunction, right? But then, the next night, it happened again. Not just one machine this time, two of them, both starting up without any warning, producing the same strange items. I stood there, staring at the parts rolling off the conveyor belt. They didn't make any sense. Metal scraps, odd shapes that didn't seem to have any purpose. What was this stuff? My unease grew into full-blown paranoia. Was someone playing a trick on me? I searched the factory, looking for any sign of another person, but found nothing. I even checked the security cameras, but there was no sign of movement besides my own. The machines just kept doing their thing, churning out these random, untraceable objects. Over the next few nights, it got worse. More machines started up, each one producing something stranger than the last. My anxiety was through the roof. I wasn't sleeping well during the day, and when I was at work, I couldn't focus on anything but those machines. What the hell was going on? I decided to stay close to the machines, to catch them in the act. It was the only way to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. I parked myself near one of the older machines that had been acting up the most and waited. Hours passed, and just when I thought maybe it wouldn't happen, it did. The machine turned on with a loud clank. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as it began to produce more of those useless objects. This time, I was close enough to see what they really were: metal pieces, scraps, some with what looked like bloodstains on them. This wasn't just a glitch. Someone had to be doing this, right? I started to dig deeper, staying late after my shift to poke around. The more I looked, the more I found things that didn't add up. Old records of missing workers, accidents that were never properly reported, sections of the factory that had been shut down years ago but still had power running to them. The factory was hiding something, something dark. And those machines were tied to it. I found hidden files on the computer, old command logs that shouldn't exist. They were orders from years ago, telling the machines to produce these parts. But why? And for whom? Then I found it. A document buried deep in the system. It talked about a project, one that had been shut down after a series of incidents. The machines were producing parts for something illegal, something dangerous, the kind of thing people disappear over. And those old commands, the ones still making the machines churn out their strange products, they were a cover-up. They were still trying to erase the evidence of whatever had happened here. The more I uncovered, the more scared I became. I couldn't keep working there, not after what I'd found. I decided to quit, to get out before whatever was happening here caught up to me. But the night I planned to leave, everything went wrong. I was wrapping up my last round when all the machines turned on at once. The noise was deafening, the factory a blur of motion and sound. I tried to shut them off, but the controls wouldn't respond. The machines were out of control, spitting out those horrible bloody pieces faster and faster. It was like they were alive, trying to drown me in the past they were supposed to forget. I ran for the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. Locked, just like the machines. I was trapped. I could hear the clanking, the whirring, the chaos of the factory closing in around me. And then, over it all, I heard something else. Footsteps, coming towards me, slow and steady. I don't know if it was real, if someone was actually there, or if it was just my mind finally snapping under the pressure. But I didn't want to wait to find out. I ran deeper into the factory, into the old forgotten parts where the lights barely worked, hoping to find another way out. But there was nothing, just darkness, the echo of those footsteps, and the endless hum of the machines. The last thing I remember is turning a corner, seeing a shadow moving towards me, and then nothing. I woke up outside, the factory silent, the machines off. No sign of what happened, no sign of anyone else. I don't know how I got out, or if I really did. Maybe I'm still in there, trapped in the noise and the dark. Maybe I never escaped at all. And now, even in the daylight, I can still hear the machines, still feel that cold metal grip closing around me. I don't know what happened in that factory, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back, and neither should you. Title: The Man in the Mall. I never thought I'd end up working in an abandoned mall. It was supposed to be a temporary gig, something to keep me busy while I figured out my next move. The place was dead, both literally and figuratively, an old forgotten building full of empty stores and dust-covered mannequins. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the echo of my own footsteps. It was a lonely job, but the quietness made it easy to think. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked through the dark corridors, checking each corner, each store, making sure nothing was out of place. But it wasn't long before I started noticing things. Small things at first, like a piece of trash on the floor where it shouldn't be. I figured maybe it was just debris, something left over from the last time the mall had seen life. But it nagged at me, and I started paying more attention. One night, I found a small pile of food wrappers near an old shuttered store. They were fresh, the kind of wrappers you'd find from a snack bought at a convenience store. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I came back the next day, there were more, along with a couple of empty water bottles. Someone had been here. Recently. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. The mall was huge, and it was easy to imagine someone slipping in without me noticing. I started making my rounds more carefully, checking behind every corner, under every counter. But no matter how hard I looked, I never found anyone. Then, things started to get weirder. I found a blanket tucked in a corner behind some old mannequins. It was dirty, worn, like it had been there for a while, but I knew it hadn't been there the night before. My heart started racing. Someone was definitely living in the mall. But who? And why hadn't I seen them? I started hearing things, footsteps in the distance, the creak of a door opening somewhere far away. Every time I rushed to the sound, there was nothing, just silence. It was like the mall itself was playing tricks on me. But the evidence was there. Someone was in the mall with me, and they were staying just out of sight. One night, I heard a door creak open nearby. This time, I was ready. I moved quickly, quietly, towards the sound. My heart was pounding in my chest as I rounded the corner, flashlight in hand. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving quickly between the stores. I called out, trying to sound calm, but inside, I was terrified. The shadow didn't stop. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of hurried footsteps. I couldn't sleep after that. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who this person was. I started digging into the mall's history, hoping to find some clues. That's when I found out about the homeless man. He'd been living in the mall years ago, hiding in the shadows, much like whoever was here now. They found him dead in one of the back rooms, long after the mall had closed. He'd been there for months, living off whatever he could find, completely unnoticed. I started to wonder if the person living here now could be him. Maybe he never left. Maybe he was still here, hiding in the dark corners, watching me. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't let it go. I considered quitting, just walking away and never looking back. But something kept pulling me back, like I needed to know the truth. Then, one night, it happened. I was making my rounds when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, his back to me. He was tall, thin, and his clothes were tattered like they hadn't been changed in years. His hair was wild, his skin pale. He looked like he hadn't seen daylight in a long, long time. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly approached him. I wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, but the words wouldn't come out. Before I could get too close, he turned and ran. I chased after him, but he was fast, too fast. He disappeared into the mall's labyrinth of corridors, leaving me standing there, out of breath, heart pounding. I realized then that I was trapped in this game, a deadly game of cat and mouse. But the lines were blurring, and I wasn't sure who was the hunter and who was the hunted anymore. I haven't seen him since that night, but I know he's still there, somewhere in the darkness. I hear him sometimes, late at night, when the mall is at its quietest. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of a door opening. I don't know if it's real anymore or if I'm just losing my mind, but I can't shake the feeling that he's watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the worst part? I don't think I'll ever know who he really is. Or maybe, deep down, I already do. I work the night shift at the subway station. It's a lonely job, mostly cleaning up after the day's rush. I'm used to the emptiness after the last train leaves, the silence only broken by the hum of the lights and the distant echo of the city above. But last night something felt different, something I can't shake off. I found a camera. It was small, black, and left on a bench near the end of the platform. I noticed it during my final sweep of the station. At first, I thought it was just another item lost by a passenger in a hurry. But this time, I hesitated. I don't know why, but I decided not to turn it in. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket, telling myself I'd watch the footage later and see if I could find the owner. When I got home, curiosity got the better of me. I plugged the camera into my laptop and started watching. At first, it was nothing unusual, just regular passengers waiting for the train. Some were scrolling through their phones, others were talking, their voices faint but clear in the background. Then something caught my eye. A man standing alone, staring directly at the camera. He wasn't moving, just staring. His face was emotionless, almost too calm. It gave me a chill, but I brushed it off. Weird things happen in the subway all the time, right? The footage continued, each clip showing different times of the day. There were more passengers, more everyday scenes. But that man, the one who stared, he kept showing up. Always in the background, always staring. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, it didn't feel like one. Then the footage changed. The station was empty now. The time on the screen showed just after midnight, right after the last train had left. I recognized the station. It was the one I worked at. The camera seemed to be left on the floor, pointing at the platform. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, only broken by the occasional drip of water from somewhere out of view. Suddenly, a figure appeared. It was a woman, but her movements were strange, almost robotic. She walked to the center of the platform and just stood there. Then, more people appeared, one by one, all moving in that same unnatural way. They formed a circle, facing inward, their heads bowed. What happened next made my skin crawl. They started to chant, a low rhythmic sound that I could barely make out. It wasn't in any language I recognized. Their movements became more erratic, their bodies swaying as the chanting grew louder. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel the intensity, the dark energy of whatever they were doing. Then the camera shook, as if someone had picked it up. The footage became chaotic, a blur of motion and noise. I could hear heavy breathing, the sound of someone running. The last thing the camera captured was a glimpse of a man's face, twisted in fear, before the screen went black. I sat there, frozen. The man in the final frame. He looked like my colleague Jason, who had vanished a few weeks ago without a trace. Everyone assumed he just quit, maybe went off the grid. But now, I wasn't so sure. The thought of what I had just seen made my blood run cold. This wasn't just some weird footage. It was something else, something dangerous. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, heard their chants. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, maybe a film project someone left behind, but it didn't add up. Why was Jason in the footage? Why did they look so real, so terrifying? The next night, I did something I knew I shouldn't. I went back to the station. I had to see if it would happen again, if those people would return. The station was just as empty and quiet as always, but now it felt different. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. I walked the length of the platform, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Nothing happened at first. It was just me and the hum of the lights. But as the night wore on, the air grew heavy, like something was about to happen. I kept looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick by. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin prickling with anxiety. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, light but distinct, coming from the far end of the platform. I turned, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps grew closer, then stopped suddenly. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, any sign of movement. The station was deadly quiet again, but I could feel it. The presence of someone, or something, watching me. Panic set in. I wanted to leave, to run out of that place and never look back. But my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. Then I heard it, the chant, the same low rhythmic sound from the footage. It was coming from the shadows, from the very spot where the circle had formed in the video. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and bolted towards the exit, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached the stairs, something grabbed me, pulling me back. I fought against it, adrenaline surging through me, but whatever it was held on tight. The chant grew louder, surrounding me, filling my head with a dark, terrifying energy. And then, just like that, it stopped. The grip on me loosened, and I stumbled forward, gasping for breath. When I turned around, there was nothing. No one was there. The station was empty, just as it had been before. I don't know how I made it out, but I did. I haven't gone back since. I quit my job the next day. I can't explain what happened, and I don't want to. But every night I hear that chant in my dreams. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next person to find their camera. Working as the night clerk at a small, remote motel isn't what you'd call exciting. I used to joke that the most action I'd see was when the vending machine got stuck. Most nights, it's quiet, with only the hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional distant sound of a car passing by on the highway. Guests usually trickle in late, tired from long drives, and I check them in, hand them a key, and watch them disappear into the darkness of the hallways. I'm alone during these shifts, which can feel lonely, but it's peaceful too. Or at least, it was. It started one night around 2 a.m. when a man walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes hollow and face pale. He asked for room 12, saying he had stayed there before and liked the view. The request seemed normal enough, but when I typed his name into the system, there was no record of him. Maybe I'd missed something, or maybe it was just a system glitch. These things happen in a place like this. I didn't think much of it, so I gave him the key and watched him shuffle off down the hallway. The next night, I was back on duty, and it was around the same time when the same man walked in. Same worn-out look, same request for room 12. Now this is where I started to feel something was off. I knew I hadn't deleted any records, and yet, when I checked the system again, there was still no sign of him. I asked him, trying to keep it casual, if he'd enjoyed his stay last night. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind and said it was his first night here. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't show my unease. I handed him the key again, and he walked away like nothing strange was happening. By the third night, I was on edge. I kept thinking about that man all day, wondering what was going on. It was like I was in some kind of loop. When he walked in that night, my hands started to shake as I typed his name into the system. No records. Again. I almost didn't want to give him the key this time, but what could I do? He didn't seem dangerous, just tired, so I handed it over, my mind racing as I watched him head towards room 12 once more. After he disappeared down the hallway, I couldn't sit still. I started checking everything. The security cameras, the guest logs, even the cleaning records from housekeeping. But there was nothing. No one else had noticed him. It was like he wasn't even there. But I saw him every night, same time, same tired look. My heart pounded in my chest, and I began to question if I was losing it. I even considered telling my boss, but how would that sound? Hey, so there's this guy who keeps checking in, but there's no record of him. I'd sound crazy. By the fourth night, I was dreading the time when he'd walk through the door. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Was this real, or was I imagining things? When he arrived, I forced myself to ask if he'd been staying here long. He just gave me that same blank look and said he was new to the area. I didn't know what to do, so I checked him in, my stomach twisting with fear. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. On the fifth night, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep letting this happen, whatever it was. When he showed up again, I decided I was going to follow him. I waited until he disappeared into room 12, then grabbed the master key and headed down the hallway. My palms were sweaty as I approached the door. I knocked softly at first, then louder. No answer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Finally, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was empty, completely untouched. The bed was made, and everything was in its place, like no one had ever been there. Panic surged through me. I'd seen him go in, I was sure of it. But now, there was nothing. No sign of him, no sign of anyone. I backed out of the room, nearly tripping over my own feet, and slammed the door shut. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic to this, no explanation that made any sense. I hurried back to the front desk, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I needed to see if the system had logged his check-in, needed some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I pulled up the guest log, my blood ran cold. There it was. His name, the same as before, but this time, It was written in my handwriting, my own handwriting, like I had done it myself and somehow forgotten. But that wasn't possible. I hadn't logged him in. I hadn't. The door to the motel creaked open, and I looked up, feeling the blood drain from my face. There he was, standing in the doorway, just as tired and worn out as the first night. He didn't say anything, didn't ask for the key. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes, waiting. And that's when I realized I wasn't just seeing things. Something was very, very wrong, and it wasn't going to stop until I did something about it. But what could I do? Call the police? Tell them about a man who checks in every night but doesn't exist? They'd think I was crazy. I haven't been back to the motel since that night. I quit the next morning, didn't even bother to explain why. I couldn't stay there, couldn't face whatever was happening in room 12. But sometimes, late at night, I still see his face. I still wonder if he's checking in, if he's waiting for me to return. But I won't. I can't. Because whatever is happening there, it's something that doesn't belong in this world. The screams in the empty cell. I've been working the night shift at the prison for over a decade. Most nights it's the same routine. Endless rounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional shout from a restless inmate. But lately, things have been different. There's been a heaviness in the air, a quiet that doesn't feel right, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like something is watching you from the shadows. Tonight, that feeling is stronger than ever. The other guards took a break together, leaving me to cover the rounds alone. I don't mind being alone usually, but tonight, I wish they hadn't left. The silence is oppressive, and every creak of the old building makes me jump. I start my rounds walking past rows of cells where inmates lie sleeping or muttering to themselves. Everything seems normal until I reach the older section of the prison. This part is barely used anymore, just a few storage rooms and an empty block of cells that haven't seen a prisoner in years. That's when I hear it, a faint, distant scream. My first thought is that it's coming from one of the occupied cells, maybe someone having a nightmare. But the sound doesn't fit. It's not a scream of anger or pain. It's pure terror, raw and desperate. And it's coming from the old cell block, the one that's supposed to be empty. I stop in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct is to ignore it, to pretend I didn't hear anything. But something pushes me to move forward, to find out what's going on. Maybe it's just a trick of the old building, I tell myself. Maybe the sound is echoing from somewhere else. But deep down, I know that's not true. The screams continue, growing louder as I approach the block. My hands start to shake as I fumble for the keys. When I reach the cell where the noise is coming from, the screams suddenly stop. I stand there, frozen, staring at the door in front of me. The silence is heavier than before, almost suffocating. I unlock the door, my fingers trembling. The hinges creak loudly as I push it open, and I'm greeted by a wall of darkness. My flashlight cuts through the black, revealing the inside of the cell. It's empty, completely empty. The bed is perfectly made, untouched, like no one has been here in years. But the air is thick with something I can't describe, like a presence that lingers just out of sight. I step inside, my breath catching in my throat. The air is colder here, and I can feel a slight breeze even though there's no window. I sweep the light across the room, my heart racing. But there's nothing. No one. As I turn to leave, something on the floor catches my eye. It's small, barely noticeable, but it stops me in my tracks. A dark stain, dried and old, almost hidden in the shadows. I kneel down to get a better look, and my stomach twists as I realize what it is. Blood. I stand up quickly, the air suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. I need to get out of here. I close the cell door behind me, locking it as fast as I can, but as I start to walk away, the screams start again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. My head is spinning. I try to tell myself it's just the building, just the wind, but I know that's a lie. I rush back to the main office, my heart pounding in my ears. I need answers. Something is very wrong here, and I have to know what it is. I dig through the old files, searching for anything that might explain what's happening. Finally, I find it. A record of the last inmate who occupied that cell. He was a young man, brought in for something minor, but he never made it out. According to the file, he died in that cell. The cause of death was listed as suicide, but the notes are vague, almost like someone didn't want to write down the truth. There's mention of a struggle, of unanswered screams that went on for hours before someone finally checked on him. But by then, it was too late. My hands start to sweat as I read the final entry in the file. The details are blurred, but one thing is clear. The inmate didn't die peacefully. There was foul play, but it was covered up. The guards involved were transferred, and the cell was closed off, left empty for years. As I sit there, the screams start again, echoing through the prison louder than ever. But this time, they're not just coming from the old block. They're everywhere, bouncing off the walls, surrounding me. The lights flicker, casting strange shadows on the walls. My heart races, and I feel a cold breeze, like someone is standing right behind me. I know I should move, run, do something, but my legs won't cooperate. I'm frozen, stuck in my chair, listening to the screams that seem to be getting closer. My mind is racing, trying to make sense of what's happening, but nothing makes sense anymore. I can't shake the feeling that the screams are trying to tell me something, that they're not just cries for help, they're a warning. The lights flicker again, and I hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, moving closer with each second. My breath catches in my throat, and I feel a cold sweat break out on my skin. I want to turn around to see who or what is behind me, but I'm too scared to move. The footsteps stop, and for a moment, there's nothing but silence. Then, a whisper, so close it feels like it's right in my ear. I can't make out the words, but the tone is unmistakable, malice, pure and simple. My blood runs cold, and I realize with a sickening certainty that whatever was done to that inmate, whatever horror he went through, it's not over. And now, it's coming for me. The last thing I hear before everything goes black is the sound of my own screams, joining the others in the empty halls. Working the night shift at the morgue had become routine for me. The silence, the cold, and the presence of death. These were all things that I had gotten used to over the years. The dark halls and the smell of chemicals no longer bothered me. I think I even found comfort in the predictability of it all. It was always quiet, always the same. But that night, everything changed. It started with an unusual delivery. The body came in late, which was rare. I remember thinking it was odd, but not impossible. People die at all hours, after all. The gurney rolled in with a squeak, and the body bag was placed on the table in front of me. But something was missing. The paperwork. There was no file, no details about who this person was or how they died. That was the first red flag. The second was when I touched the bag and felt warmth. Bodies aren't supposed to be warm when they arrive here. The warmth made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't normal, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the body had been picked up too soon, I thought. But the doubt lingered, and with each passing second, I felt more uneasy. I decided to do the right thing and report it. I reached for the phone, dialing the usual number to the front office. No tone, just silence. I hung up and tried again. Nothing. The line was dead. I checked the phone's connection, but everything seemed fine. My hands started to tremble as I tried again and again. Still nothing. It was like the world outside had gone silent, leaving me alone with this thing. The silence in the room grew heavier. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel my own pulse echoing in my ears. I was isolated in this cold, dimly lit room with a warm body and no way to reach the outside world. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut anymore. I needed to know what was inside that bag. My hands felt like they were moving on their own as I slowly unzipped it. The sound of the zipper cutting through the still air was deafening. When I pulled the bag open, my breath caught in my throat. The chest of the body was moving, just slightly, as if taking shallow breaths. The eyes were half open, dull, but not empty. It was impossible. Dead bodies don't breathe. They don't look at you. Panic washed over me, freezing me in place. This person, this body, was not dead. Or were they? I couldn't tell anymore. I questioned my own sanity, wondering if the night shift was finally getting to me. But the faint rise and fall of the chest was undeniable. I knew I had to do something, but fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if this was some kind of sick joke? I thought about the consequences, the legal nightmare if I mishandled a living person, but also the horror of what would happen if I did nothing. My mind raced as I considered my options. I could try to revive them, but the thought of touching that not quite dead body again made my skin crawl. The phone was useless, and the idea of leaving the morgue to find help seemed just as terrifying as staying. The walls felt like they were closing in, the cold seeping into my bones as the gravity of the situation pressed down on me. In the end, I knew I had to act. I couldn't just leave this person, if they were still a person, like this. I reached out with shaking hands, placing them on the chest, ready to perform CPR. But before I could start, the body took a deep, rattling breath on its own. I jerked back, nearly falling over in shock. The lights above me flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the ground unsteady beneath me. The air in the room grew thicker, making it hard to breathe, as if the very atmosphere was closing in around me. I stared at the body, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The breath was so slow, so labored, it seemed like it could be the last. But was it? Was this person alive? Or was it just some final reflex of a dying body? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at my sanity. As the lights continued to flicker, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness, I felt something snap inside me. I didn't know what was real anymore. The body on the table, the phone that wouldn't work, the oppressive silence. I couldn't trust any of it. I couldn't even trust myself. I took a step back, my legs weak, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was spinning, the cold biting deeper into my skin. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The body took another breath, even deeper this time, and the lights went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the sound of my own ragged breathing the only thing I could hear. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't let it out. All I could do was stand there, frozen in the pitch-black room, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on, but dimmer this time. The body was still there, chest still faintly moving, eyes still half open, but now it felt like those eyes were watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, leaving the morgue and everything behind. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold night. I never went back. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if the person on that table was dead or alive, or if I was losing my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel those half-open eyes watching me, waiting for me to come back. I work as a delivery driver. It's a simple job, one that lets me drive around, listen to music, and drop off packages. Usually the routes are straightforward. Addresses pop up on the GPS, I follow them, deliver the package, and move on. But yesterday was different. I got an address that didn't seem to exist. It started like any other day. I was making deliveries, one by one, nothing unusual until the last package. I looked at the address on the label and copied it into my GPS. But the GPS couldn't find it. I double-checked the address. It was correct, but no map recognized it. I thought maybe it was a new development or something out in the countryside. These things happen. So, I decided to go anyway. The directions took me out of town, past the usual delivery areas. The road became narrower, winding through fields and woods. The farther I drove, the more uneasy I felt. The trees on either side grew denser, and the road, once paved, turned to gravel. But I kept going. The GPS showed a path, so I followed. After about 30 minutes, I noticed the road had started to change. It wasn't just gravel anymore. It was overgrown, with weeds and branches reaching out as if to block the way. The trees formed a thick canopy overhead, making it dark even though it was still early afternoon. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. It felt wrong, but I was almost there, so I pushed on. Finally, the GPS announced that I had arrived. But there was no house, no mailbox, nothing but dense woods. Confused, I checked the address again. Everything was correct, but there was no sign of any residence. I got out of the van, hoping maybe I had missed a hidden driveway or something. But all I saw was a narrow, overgrown path leading into the woods. The air was still, too still. I looked around, but there was no movement, no sound. It was like the world had stopped. I considered leaving the package by the side of the road, but something felt off. Maybe it was the silence or the way the trees seemed to close in, but I decided to just head back. I got in the van, put the GPS on, and started driving. But the road wasn't the same. It took me a few minutes to realize it, but the path I was driving on wasn't the one I had come in on. The gravel was gone, replaced by a dirt road that twisted in ways I didn't recognize. I checked the GPS, but it showed that I was still on the right route. But that couldn't be right. Nothing looked familiar. I began to feel a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't sure if I had taken a wrong turn, but the road should have been straightforward. I kept driving, hoping to find a landmark, anything that would make sense. But the more I drove, the more lost I became. The road stretched on, winding through the trees with no sign of an end. Every turn led to more of the same: dirt, trees, and that eerie, oppressive silence. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The GPS kept glitching, showing different locations every time I checked, none of them making any sense. Panic started to set in. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I thought about turning back, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, the road behind me was gone, replaced by thick woods that seemed to have swallowed the path I came from. I could feel the walls closing in, the trees leaning closer as if watching me. I wasn't alone. Something was out there. As I drove, I began to hear noises, subtle at first, like footsteps crunching on leaves. Then, whispers, low and unintelligible but growing louder. Shadows flickered in the corner of my eyes, darting between the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The road didn't seem to end, and I was sure I was going in circles. But how could that be? Then I saw it. The package. It was lying in the middle of the road, the same one I was supposed to deliver. But how? I had left it behind. I slammed on the brakes, my breath caught in my throat. The package just sat there, as if mocking me, telling me that I hadn't gone anywhere. I didn't want to get out, but I couldn't just leave it there. With shaking hands, I opened the door and stepped out. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been. I picked up the package and turned back to the van, but something moved in the trees. I froze, trying to make out what it was. A figure, tall and dark, stood just at the edge of my vision, barely visible among the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I got back into the van, my mind racing. I needed to get out, but every path led me back to the same spot. The woods, the road, even the light, all of it seemed twisted, wrong. It was as if the world itself was playing a cruel joke, trapping me in this nightmare. Night was falling, and the darkness grew thicker. I was running out of options. I knew I couldn't stay in the van, so I grabbed a flashlight and decided to try my luck on foot. Maybe I could find a way out, or at least a spot where my phone would work. I walked for what felt like hours, but the woods didn't end. The trees grew closer, their branches like arms reaching out to grab me. My legs ached, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I kept going. The sounds in the woods followed me, the footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. I was losing hope, and fear was taking over. There was no escape, no way out. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled onto the road again. The same road, the same package, lying there, waiting for me. My heart sank. I hadn't gone anywhere. I was trapped, caught in a loop with no exit. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was never getting out of here. The road didn't want me to leave. I dropped the package and fell to my knees, the cold, damp ground pressing against my skin. There was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for whatever was out there to finally come for me. The darkness closed in, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I was lost, forever. Title: The Last Night Shift. Working the night shift at a crematorium isn't as spooky as you might think. It's actually kind of boring, to be honest. The dead are quiet, and the building is usually too. Most of the time, it's just me and the faint hum of the furnaces. I got used to it pretty quickly. Just another job, right? But last night, something happened that I can't shake off. I'm still trying to figure out if I imagined the whole thing or if it's just one of those sick pranks. But it felt real, too real. It started like any other night. I clocked in around 11 p.m., went through the usual routine, checking the logs, prepping the furnaces, making sure everything was in order. The building was quiet as usual, just the distant sound of burning from the main room. The air always feels heavy in there, like it's weighed down by the ashes of all those people we've sent off. I didn't think much of it. I've learned to ignore the feeling. Around midnight, I got a new delivery. That's not strange. Sometimes families want the process done as soon as possible, so we get the urns ready right away. But when I pulled the new urn out of the bag, I froze. My name was on it, my full name, and underneath it, today's date. At first, I thought it was a mistake. It had to be, right? Maybe it was for someone with the same name as me. But then, why today's date? My hands started to shake a little, but I forced myself to calm down. I told myself it was just a mix-up. A creepy one, sure, but nothing to freak out about. I went to find the guys who had dropped it off. Maybe it was a bad joke. But when I asked around, nobody knew anything about it. They all gave me the same look, confused, like I was talking nonsense. The more I asked, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the urn was waiting for me to figure it out, and I was the only one who couldn't see the obvious. I decided to just put the urn away and try to forget about it. Maybe I'd laugh about it later, once I figured out what had happened. But that's when things got weird. As the night went on, I started hearing things. At first, it was just little noises, like footsteps down the hall or something shuffling in the corner of the room. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off as nerves. I hadn't slept much the night before, and maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But then I saw something move in the shadows. It was quick, just a flash of something dark, but it made my heart pound like crazy. I felt like I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or entered a room, I half expected to see someone standing there, waiting for me. But there was never anyone. Just the urn, sitting quietly on the shelf, with my name on it. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was inside. My mind kept jumping to all kinds of horrible conclusions. Maybe there was something else in there, something that was going to make all of this make sense. So, I grabbed the urn and went to the prep room. When I opened it, I expected to see ashes, like usual, but it was empty. Completely empty. And somehow, that was even worse. It felt wrong, like the urn was waiting to be filled. With what? I didn't want to think about it. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This urn wasn't just some sick joke. It was a warning. And whatever was supposed to go inside it, it was coming soon. I started to panic. I wanted to get out of there, to just run and never look back. But before I could even think about leaving, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe it was the need to hear another human voice, to break the awful silence that was suffocating me. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice that chilled me to the bone. It was my voice, but it didn't sound right. It was cold, distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside me, but far away at the same time. "Your time has come," it said. I dropped the phone. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. But the fear wasn't just in the words. It was in the way they were spoken, like a death sentence, final and unchangeable. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, getting closer with every step. I wanted to turn around, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, forced to wait for whatever was coming. The lights flickered, then went out. I was plunged into darkness, the kind that swallows you whole. The footsteps stopped right behind me, and I could feel someone, or something, standing there, just inches away. I didn't dare breathe. Then, nothing. Just silence and darkness. I don't remember what happened after that. When I came to, the lights were back on, and I was alone. The urn was gone. So was my phone. I haven't told anyone about this. Who would believe me? But every time I close my eyes, I see that urn with my name on it, and I hear those footsteps. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I have a feeling I won't be able to run from it. Not forever. I work the night shift at a large retail store. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. The store is huge, mostly empty at night, and it can feel a bit eerie when you're alone with just the mannequins for company. They're scattered around the store, all dressed in outdated clothes that no one buys anymore. The first time I noticed something was off, it was just a small thing. One of the mannequins near the entrance seemed to have shifted slightly. I was sure it had been facing the door, but now it was turned a bit to the side. I thought I was imagining things. After all, I was tired, and it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the night went on, I started to feel uneasy. Every time I looked at the mannequins, they seemed different, like they were watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started avoiding looking directly at them, but I couldn't help glancing over every now and then, just to check. One night, it was quieter than usual, which made every small sound echo in the empty store. That's when I noticed it again. The same mannequin had moved. This time, it was turned fully toward the cash register where I was standing. I could feel its blank face staring at me, even though I knew it was just plastic. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to laugh it off. Maybe the cleaning staff had bumped into it during their rounds, or maybe I was just losing it. But it kept happening. Every night the mannequins were in different positions. And it wasn't just that one near the entrance. They all seemed to be shifting, moving closer to where I was. Some nights, I'd find them in poses that looked almost human, like they were imitating real people. There was one in particular, a female mannequin, that was posed with its hand on its hip, head tilted to the side, almost like it was mocking me. The worst part was when I started recognizing some of the faces. The mannequins were starting to look familiar, like people I had seen before. There was one that looked just like a regular customer who used to come in every week. I hadn't seen him in a while, and now here he was, or rather, a mannequin version of him, staring at me from across the store. I knew it was impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequins were somehow modeled after real people, people I knew. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking things, but the fear kept growing. I didn't want to go to work anymore, but I needed the job. So, I kept going, night after night, pretending everything was normal. Then, one night, everything changed. I was halfway through my shift when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a new mannequin in the store. It was positioned near the men's section, dressed in the same clothes as one of my co-workers who had recently stopped coming to work. At first, I didn't recognize it, but then it hit me. The face, the clothes, the stance. It was all too familiar. This mannequin looked exactly like my co-worker, right down to the small scar above his left eyebrow. Panic set in. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was going on. My hands were shaking as I walked over to the mannequin. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The details were too perfect, too real. In a moment of pure terror, I shoved the mannequin and it toppled over, hitting the floor with a loud crash. The impact caused it to break apart, and what I saw inside made me scream. There, beneath the plastic exterior, were human remains. I could see bones, skin, and even hair tangled inside the mannequin. It wasn't just a model. It was a person, my co-worker, or what was left of him. I turned and ran, heart pounding, desperate to get out of the store. But when I reached the exit, the doors wouldn't open. I was trapped. I could feel the mannequins watching me, their plastic eyes boring into my back. I tried every door, but they were all locked. I was alone, surrounded by these horrifying things, and I couldn't escape. Just when I thought I was done for, I found a back door that was slightly ajar. I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open and ran out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the store. I quit my job the next day. I tried to tell people what I had seen, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy, said I must have been sleep deprived or something. The store removed the mannequin and carried on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the images from my mind. A few weeks later, I was walking past the store late at night. I didn't want to look, but something drew my eyes to the display window. There, under the dim lights, I saw a new mannequin. My blood ran cold as I recognized the face. It was me. The mannequin was dressed in the same clothes I had worn on my last shift, posed in the same way I used to stand behind the counter. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. They were watching me, or maybe they were waiting for me. I don't know what's going to happen, but I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that mannequin, and I know that one day I might be next.